Well, good morning. How's everyone doing today? Let me hear you. How you guys doing today? There we go. That's rowdy. You're rowdier than first service, so that's good. Hey, a couple of summers ago, I was like, it was summertime, and I wanted to do something different with our family. You know, we were other than just a Six Flags trip or just going down into the city to do something fun and hanging out. So I thought, let's go kayaking as a family. That'd be cool. That'd be fun because, and not just any kayaking, but kayaking on the Chicago River, downtown Chicago. Any of you guys ever been on this? Like, it's awesome. Like, and I remember every time I go downtown, one of my favorite spots is on the bridge of Michigan and Wacker, and you can look out into the river and see all the skyscrapers around. And every once in a while, I'll be there and I'll see one of these kayakers, and they look so small amidst all these big, ships and freights and all this other stuff. And I'm like that'd be so cool to do that. And so I told my family, this is what I want to do. This is an adventure that we're going to take this summer. I was excited. My family, not so much, right? They weren't as excited as I was, but I convinced them to do it. And so they were like, if you can get the date and set a time and all that kind of stuff. So I called around. I found a company that did this. And so we headed down there, and I was excited. Again, not so much the rest of my family. I think they were a little bit tentative. Like, they didn't mind going down the river in a kayak, but in Chicago and all the ships and freights and the barges that were going along, they were a little timid about it. So we finally get there, and they start going over all the rules. We had to sign a waiver form. I think it was like 3 pages. By the way, when you start to go kayaking down the Chicago River and they make you sign a 3-page waiver, that sort of gets you a little nervous, right? And so we were doing all that kind of stuff, and they said, hey, we have 1 or 2 person kayaks. And you have to be at least 16 years of age to go on a kayak by yourself. And that meant our oldest son, Carson, could go by himself. So he decided to go by himself. I got me and my son, Ethan, with us in a 2-person one. And then it was left Savannah and Amy Jo. Now, Savannah and Amy Jo, they were really scared. Okay? And it didn't really help a whole lot when the guy said, okay, here's what you need to understand. You are the smallest thing on the river, okay? Everything else is going to be bigger than you, okay? There's going to be all kinds of boats. There's going to be barges, and you need to stay always to the right. And when one of those bigger things come your way, you get all the way to the right. So you're touching the wall, okay? Because they can't stop. They can't even see you sometimes, and they will run you over. And my wife looks at me like she is terrified in this moment. She's like, I don't want to do this. Let's go to the Navy Pier. Let's do something else. I'm like, no, this will be fun, famous last words, right? And so we put in after we get scared to death. And as he's saying this, a barge passes by, okay? As he's warning us about this huge barge that could run over us. So we get in there, and, I was pretty good. Me and Ethan were pretty good, and Carson was pretty good. And as we put out, there were really no other boats around, no ships, and so it was pretty calm where we put out. And so it was pretty fun, pretty calm. And Amy Jo and Savannah, for some reason, I thought they had been kayaking before, but they said, we've never been kayaking before. And they didn't really know what to do. They didn't know how to row. And so I'm teaching them how to row. It's like, oh, come on. We told them we were experienced kayakers, Let's get going here. And so finally they were struggling. They finally got the hold of it. And I got to be honest with you, about halfway down, it was a 90-minute trip. Back and forth, and we could go pretty much all the way to the locks that head into the lake. And so I'm just eating this up. I love it. Like, I'm on the water. I'm in my sweet place, in life. And I look up, and there's a wall of skyscrapers on my left. There's a wall of skyscrapers on my right. And it's just amazing. And it's just overwhelming, to be honest with you. You feel so tiny when you're in a kayak on the Chicago River and you're looking up at all these huge buildings. Well, there was a part, and the guy had warned us, there was a part of this where it's a Y, and you have to take one or the other, and we had to take this to the left, and we had to cross over the entire part of the river. And he said, now you need to be careful because this is where a lot of ships and boats get going. And so we get to that place, and my wife, Amy Jo, is freaking out. She's all nervous about this. And I'm like, we just gotta go. You gotta paddle fast and don't hesitate. And about the time that we were crossing the river, there were started just to be all different types of boats, big boats, small boats, everything was bigger than us, right? And then we're crossing, and Amy Jo and Savannah are there, and I'm like, you gotta go, come on. And we're almost to the other side, and I'm just yelling as loud as I can, row, get going. And as soon as they started rowing, no lie, there is a barge coming, okay? And now it's a little bit of a distance from us. They're not like right up in us, but Amy Jo and Savannah are going slow. And I'm like, you've got to go. And I'm screaming and yelling, and she's like terrified. And I have this image in my mind at that moment. I look at Ethan and it's like, they're gonna get hit by that barge if they don't move it, And I thought my wife and my daughter were dead, and they're just screaming and yelling. I'm like, you gotta row faster and faster and faster. And they're screaming at the top of their lungs. No one else can hear. The barge doesn't care, right? The bar continues to come. It is not slowing down. It is not stopping. And finally, they just row, and they get in the rhythm, and they row, and they row, and they row. And finally, they get to the other side. And as soon as they hit the wall, no lie, that barge was right where they were going to be at. And we're like, whoa, that was too close. And we were now safe on that side, and we were touching the wall. All the boats had left, and so it was sort of calm, and I was loving it. My heart's beating fast, but Amy Jo, I look over at Amy Jo, and she gives me a look that only Amy Jo can give her husband of 23 years, and she looked at me, and everything's calm now. We're good, right? We're safe. And she looks at me, and she says, I hate this. We should have gone to Navy Pier. Isn't that how life often plays out? Like you're going along, and all of a sudden, something comes your way that just rocks your world. And it's coming at you fast, and it's coming at you hard, and you look up, and all the circumstances around you is bigger than you. Everything is so overwhelming, and you just don't know what to do. Let me ask you, when you find yourself in that kind of situation, what do you do? What do you do when life is bigger than you? I mean, when you are just overwhelmed by your circumstances, when there's fear that has paralyzed you, when there's relationships that has gone sideways, when life, quite honestly, is just too much to handle, what do you do? What's your response? Well, that's a good answer. Yeah, pray. I mean, one of the good things is, I've got to tell you today, the good news is that I believe that it's in those moments when life is bigger than you, when life comes at you fast and hard and you don't know what to do next, that God has a specific plan and a unique plan for those very moments in your life. God has a unique plan for just those moments in our lives. A great example of this is found in the Old Testament of the Bible by a story of a guy named Gideon. Now, some of you guys have heard of Gideon. Some of you guys may not know much about Gideon. Gideon was part of God's people, the Israelites, and he became at some point in his life this mighty hero that everyone would look up to, this fierce warrior that ultimately became a spiritual legend for the Jewish people. In fact, so much so, he was so popular, such a fierce warrior, such a legend among the Jewish people, that he actually made the Hall of Fame when it comes to the Jewish faith. Thousands of years after his life, they're still talking about him in the book of Hebrews in the Bible, in Hebrews chapter 11. Chapter 11 is this special chapter in the Bible. The writer of Hebrews is recalling about all the men and women of faith who have come before us. That did remarkable things in the name of God, by the power of God. It's what we might call the Hall of Faith for the Christianity. And toward the end of this, he's listing all these names, all these men, all these women who have just done incredible things by way of faith in God. And this is what he says in verse 32 as he's closing out this Hall of Faith list. He says, how much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Now, when I read something like this, when we read something like this, or all the other stories of the Bible of these legends of the faith, we look at them and we think, boy, they just seem larger than life. I don't even know if I can relate to some of these people. They just seem larger than life to me. And the truth of the matter is, this guy named Gideon, who's mentioned here in the Hall of Faith, he may seem larger than life, but the truth is, oftentimes in his own life, what he discovered is life was larger than him. He was overwhelmed by his circumstances. And through his story this morning, as we explore his story, I think we're going to discover a lot about our own stories, my story, your story. Now, his story is found in the book of Judges in the Old Testament of the Bible. And I just want to give you some backdrop to the book of Judges and to Gideon's story, because you're going to be able to appreciate his story much more if you understand what's going on at the time. God's people, the Israelites, they had been in this perpetual unhealthy cycle with God. You could say that they were experiencing this like spiritual bipolar history for their people, right? It was a very spiritually divisive time. They were always up and down, and you didn't know where they were being at. And this is how this cycle played out in the lives of the people of Israel. They would be going along fine, and they would love God and obey God, and God would bless them, and God would give them victory in battle, and God would give them everything that they ever wanted as long as they were obeying Him. And they were in sync with God. They were in love with God, and God was so proud of them. But they got bored with that. And they're led to some spiritual complacency. And so they decided to, hey, you know what? Let's see what else is out there. And they decided to go their own way at times. They decided to worship other gods and try out some of the gods of these other nations and these other people groups. And we're sort of bored with God. And so they sort of forgot God. And as a result, God came back and said, okay, you forget me. I'm going to hand you over to your enemies, whoever those enemies might be at the time. And so God would hand them over to their enemies, and as a result, they would suffer big time. And they would get into trouble, and they'd have all these problems. And then after a while, they got so bad, they became so desperate, life got so bigger than themselves, that they cried out to their God, the God who they had abandoned and forgotten. And as always, God would reveal himself to them. He would show them mercy and love and forgiveness, and he would do this by raising up a judge, a leader, a ruler. This was before the Israelites had kings. And the goal of every judge, God would raise up a person to be a judge and to rule the people. And the goal was that, hey, bring my people back to me. Do some kind of spiritual awakening. Get them back on track with me. And they would. And as a result, it would be a love fest, right? They would be in sync with God, and they would love and obey God, and God would bless them, and the good times was rolling until they get a little bit bored, some spiritual complacency, and they would decide, let's try something else, let's go our own way. And then God would say, hey, you're not obeying me, I'm going to hand you over to your enemies. And then they would suffer, and then they'd cry out to God, and the cycle was endless for the people of Israel. And it's not really unlike the cycle that you and I experience in life. I mean, I think it's just a part of our flawed human condition. I think from time to time we all experience it. And here's the deal. If you're not careful, you and I, we could be trapped in that cycle our whole lives. If you're not careful, you will find yourself stuck in this up and down relationship with the God of the universe your whole life. And that's where we find the people of Israel. They're stuck in this cycle, and they don't know how to get out of it. And it's bad. In fact, in Judges chapter 6, they had started worshiping some other gods, and so God said, hands off, and he handed them over to a group of people, their enemies, the nemesis of the Israelites at the time, the Midianites. Now, these Midianites, they were evil people. They were bad people, and they hated the Israelites, and they spent all of their time terrorizing them and oppressing them. They were sort of that thorn in the Israelites' side. And what they do on a regular basis is they just come over and they would spy out the land, and they would invade the Israelite people, and they would steal all their valuables and all their possessions and all their crops, and they would destroy and burn down villages. I mean, they owned the Israelites. The Midianites during the time of Gideon owned the Israelites, just like the Packers with the Bears, okay? They owned them. But I've got to tell you, it was more than just playground bullying. It got really bad. In Judges chapter 6, verse 6, we see how bad it had become. In verse 6, this is the cycle they were in and how they had been bullied so much and oppressed by the Midianites. It says this: so Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. And then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. See, this has been going on for 7 years. And they had experienced really bad things. They were being oppressed to the point that they were starving to death. I mean, we find them at the beginning of the story. The people of God were desperate. Life had become way bigger than themselves. They were overwhelmed. Now, a word of encouragement. It's when you are most overwhelmed that God chooses to reveal his overcoming power. Like, if you don't get anything else today, get this. It's when you are most overwhelmed, when life is bigger than you, and you feel like life is coming at you fast and it's coming at you hard. It's in those moments that God chooses to reveal to you his overcoming power. In your overwhelming moments, God overcomes. He'll help you, I promise, if you allow him to give you the power to overcome whatever is overwhelming in your life. As the people of Israel are about to discover, as they cry out to their God for help. And as always, God comes through for them. God rescues them. God responds to that. And this is where we're introduced to our hero. Verse 11, then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, not Oprah, okay, but Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Sir, Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites. Then the Lord turned to him and said, go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you, Gideon. But Lord, Gideon replied, how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family. And we're going to stop there for a moment because this is an incredible dialogue that the angel of the Lord has with Gideon. Now, even though the angel of the Lord would talk from occasion to occasion, this was the very first time that the angel of the Lord had come to Gideon. He was already afraid of the Midianites, and now an angel of the Lord comes and talks to him. Now, what I find fascinating about this first interaction between the angel of the Lord and Gideon is how the angel of the Lord addresses Gideon. The angel of the Lord says, mighty hero. I love that. Like, that's how the angel of the Lord chooses to start out the conversation. Mighty hero, I'm looking at you deep down in the winepress. Mighty hero. Now, we're going to discover in just a few seconds that Gideon in that moment is far from being a mighty hero. But yet the angel of the Lord says, mighty hero. In fact, I think that's so cool. How cool would that be is if you go to work tomorrow, you go home to your family today, and they just address you as mighty hero. Like, wouldn't that be cool? Like, I really think I'm going to go home today and make my family address me that way from now on. Mighty hero. Like, it's so cool that the angel of the Lord says this to Gideon. But as I said, what I find fascinating is in this very moment that he calls him mighty hero, Gideon is far from it. In fact, he's the opposite. Look at where he's at in that moment that the angel of God comes to him and says, mighty hero. In verse 11 again, it says, Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a wine press. Now, our cultural context makes it really hard for us to know really what's going on in this story right now. So here's the deal. In ancient Israel, a wine press was usually made of stone. It was a small, tight area, and it was deep. And here we find Gideon deep into this small area in this wine press. And the Bible says that at this time, he's threshing wheat. I'm not a farmer, but this is not the ideal place to thresh wheat, okay? In the bottom of a stone barrel with no area. Now, again, I've done some research because I don't really know how to thresh wheat. That's new to me. I'm a city boy. But back in those days, this is how you would thresh wheat. You would stomp and trample over the wheat to separate, to divide the straw from the wheat. And then you would throw it up in the air, and the wind would take the straw because it's so light, and the wheat would drop to the ground, and then you would collect the wheat from the ground. This is how you would thresh wheat in those days, and it was used in an open area. You would always choose an open area. It had to be a big open area to thresh the wheat. So as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, what is Gideon doing threshing wheat in this tight, deep, stone-encased wine press? Like, that's not gonna work, Gideon. Like, what is he doing? Why is he doing this? I'll tell you why. Because he's afraid. He's afraid that he's going to lose all of his food. He's afraid that he's going to get killed by the Midianites. He's afraid of losing everything. In this very moment, he's like a little kid, cowardly hiding from the enemy. Life has become so much bigger than him. He is anything but a mighty hero. I mean, this is not the stuff of legends, right? This is something more. He's terrified and he's hiding out at the bottom of a wine press. But this is his reality. And if we were honest, from time to time, this is our reality. Right? There are times in our life where we just find ourselves at the bottom of a wine press. We're overwhelmed. Life is bigger than us in that moment. My guess is some of you, as you're sitting here today, as you're watching us online, you're probably there. Fear and uncertainty, man, it's got a hold of you, and you don't know what to do with it. Uncertainty and confusion about who you are and about your future has pushed you deep, deep down into that wine press. Emotional or physical health has you discouraged and not yourself. The fear of some consequence in your life, the death of a loved one or the close death of a loved one, and life has just gotten bigger than you could ever imagine. And you've got problems on your left, you got problems on your right, and you don't know how to deal with any of it. You ever been there? It's while there, at the bottom of the wine press, that we ask the same two questions that Gideon asked here. He asked the angel of God two things. He says, why and how? He asked those two questions. Why? God, why aren't you responding to me? I'm desperate for you. Why aren't you responding to our people like you did when you delivered them from slavery in Egypt? God, why is this always happening to me? God, why am I always in pain? Why am I always afraid? God, why are you bringing this bad into my family's life or to my friend's life? God, why aren't you responding to my prayers? I'm desperate for you and I can't hear you. Why, God? And we ask how, just like Gideon. God, how are you ever going to get me out of this? How am I ever? I don't see any hope. I don't know how I'm ever going to get out of this wine press. God, how are you going to pull it off? Yeah, pastor says that God can use us and he has unique plans for me, but God, I don't know how you're going to do that. I don't know how you're going to use someone like me. I've messed up so many times. I've failed you so many times. I'm not special. How in the world are you ever going to use me like you did those people in the Bible? Now, those are fair questions. Why and how? Fair questions. But I'm telling you, those aren't the questions that are going to get you up out of the winepress. See, the key for you and I to get up out of that winepress and to move forward is to move away from the questions of why and how to the questions of who and what. God, who do you want me to become? God, what do you want me to do? See, we got to move away from those two questions of why and how to the questions of who and what. And the reason why, while we're in the wine press, why we like to ask the questions why and how is because we tend to focus more on our circumstances of life than in our faith in Jesus. Why and how are reactive questions. And when you're in the bottom of the wine press and life is bigger than you, we want to just simply react. But the truth of the matter, the questions of how and or who and what, those questions are proactive. See, here's how this plays out in our lives, because we like the questions why and how. We like to ask those questions as we react to our circumstances. And we'll go along and we'll say, okay, I believe this to be true about God. I believe this to be true about Jesus Christ. And then all of a sudden, our circumstances change. And instead of looking at our circumstances through the lens of what we believe to be true about God, we look at God and we adjust our philosophy about God based on what we believe to be true about our circumstances. It happens all the time. What we end up doing, and I do this as much as anyone else, I allow my circumstances to change my view of God. It gets distorted. And the key is to get the focus off of who you are and what you're going through and get your focus on who God is and what he wants to do through you. Exactly what is happening in this story. He's afraid. He's hiding out in the bottom of a wine press. And he continues. He doesn't know what to do. Verse 16, the Lord said to him, listen, I know you're afraid. I know you have your doubts, but I will be with you. And you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. Here's what God basically says here to Gideon. He says, hey, don't sweat it. I've got your back. I've got your back, Gideon. Like, here's my plan for you. Here's who I want you to become. I want you to become the leader of God's people and overcome the enemies of the Midianites. And I know it doesn't look good right now, but it will. Trust me. And I will be with you every step of the way. In fact, I'm going to show you my power so much that it's going to seem like you're just fighting against one person out there. That's how powerful. That's how much I'm going to be with you. That's how much I'm going to give you my power. Now, by the way, this is a foreshadowing of how Gideon actually does take down the Midianites. Now, I wish we had time today, but we don't on that whole story. But we, by the way, spoiler alert, okay? If you don't know the story and you're gonna go read it tonight, which I would encourage you to do, plug your ears right now because here's a spoiler for you, is Gideon takes down the Midianites. And the story is cool how he does it. There's 135,000 men in the army of the Midianites. God chooses to dwindle the number of the Israelites down to 300. God says, okay, you're ready to go defeat the Midianites. And Gideon does, and he obeys. And at the end of this story, at the end of his life, he is the fierce warrior that takes 300 men and defeats 135,000. Takes them down. Now, God knows this. God knows what he's capable of doing in the life of Gideon. All he needs is Gideon to get on board. And so he says here the same thing he says to you and to me. You've got this. Gideon, you've got this. Steve, you've got this. Whatever, you've got this because I've got you. And some of you guys need to hear that right now. Some of you guys are desperate to hear that right now. Listen, you've got this because God says, I've got you. When your plans go sideways and nothing is working out in life the way you had thought, God comes to you and says, you've got this because I've got you. When you're losing confidence in yourself and in your future and in your potential, God comes to you and says, you've got this because I've got you. When family or finances has you lost for answers and solutions, God comes to you and says, listen, you've got this because I've got you. When fear and brokenness has you paralyzed and you can't move forward in life, God comes to you and says, you've got this because I've got you. That's what he's saying to Gideon here. That's what he's saying to us. Now, Gideon, he's so afraid. He's so overwhelmed that this isn't enough. So look what happens next in verse 17. Gideon replied, okay, if you are truly going to help me, like if that is true, if I've got this because you've got me, God, show me a sign to prove that it is really the Lord speaking to me. Don't go away until I come back and bring my offering to you. So the angel answered, I will stay here until you return. So Gideon hurried home. He cooked a young goat with a basket of flour. He baked some bread without yeast. Then, carrying the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, he brought them out and presented them to the angel who was under the giant tree. Then the angel of God said to him, place the meat and the unleavened bread on this rock and pour the broth over it. And Gideon did this as he was told. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and bread with the tip of his staff in his hand, and fire flamed up from the rock and consumed all that he had brought. And the angel of the Lord disappeared. Now when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he cried out, oh, sovereign Lord, I am doomed. I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. It's all right, the Lord replied. Do not be afraid. You will not die. And so Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and named it Yahweh Shalom, which means the Lord is peace. And the altar remains there in Ophrah, in the land of the clan of Abiezer to this day. I love what's happening here. And throughout this story, what I really appreciate is that God never gets angry with Gideon because of his doubt, because he says, okay, I'm going to test you. If you are really with me, if you are really that powerful, then I'm going to test you. And throughout this story, he does it not once, not twice, but 3 times. He tests God just to make sure that he was honest. And God, through all of this, never gets angry at Gideon with his doubt, with his testing. I love it. Why? Because God knows Gideon. He can see his future potential. And so what God is doing in this very moment is growing Gideon's faith at Gideon's pace. He's patient with Gideon. And the same is true for you and for me. He's patient with you. He knows who he wants you to become. He knows what you want to do, what he wants you to do, and he is growing your faith at your pace. But he is relentless in that pursuit. You need to know that there is nothing that you can do that's going to escape God pursuing you to become who he wants you to become and what he wants you to do. See, I think that's why so many people never find peace in life, not sustaining peace. Because consciously or subconsciously, many of us, we're running away from God's desires and who he wants us to be and what he wants us to do. And that's what's happening here with Gideon. And that subconscious or conscious decision to run away from God leads to a miserable existence. But God knew Gideon. He knew the potential. He knew what he was able to do through Gideon. And the same is true for you. He knows you. He knows all your baggage. He knows all your issues. He knows all your hang-ups. He knows all your sin. He's aware of all your doubts. He acknowledges all your weaknesses and all your limitations. He knows where you started out on this journey. He knows where you're heading on this journey. And he is patiently working to grow your faith at your pace, just like he did with Gideon. look at as we continue to discover more and more about how this happens in verse 25. God's growing Gideon's faith at his pace. So here's what you need to do next. That night, the Lord said to Gideon, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that is 7 years old. Pull down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah poles standing beside it. Then build an altar to the Lord your God here on this hilltop sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar, using as fuel the wood of the Asherah pole you cut down. So God is wanting, he's wanting Gideon to deal with one thing first. He says, before you really have to go and defeat the Midianites, before you do that, here's what I want you to do. I want you to tear down all the idols. Like there's so many idols that you've been worshiping. The first thing I want you to do, I've got a big plan for you, but the first thing you need to do is tear down those idols before I use you in a bigger way, a greater way. And it's in this that we find God's process for growth, for your growth, for my growth, and it's this: you tear down and you build up. That's God's plan. That's God's process for your growth in faith. You tear down and you build up. See, when life gets too big for you, the first thing we need to do when you're in that wine press is to tear down those idols in your life. Now, an idol is anything that you're placing trust in more than in God for whatever is going to satisfy you. It could be money or things or possessions, relationships, success, a job, selfishness, pride, fear. You have to ask yourself, what is standing in my way for becoming who God wants me to become and do what God wants me to do? If anything is standing in that way, that is an idol. And God says the first thing you need to do when life gets bigger than you, the first thing you need to do to get you up out of the wine press is to tear down those idols. In our front yard at our house, there's this beautiful Japanese tree. I don't know what type of Japanese tree it is, but it's a beautiful Japanese, well, it was a beautiful Japanese tree. About 2 years ago, it died. And we were like, why is it dying? We don't understand. And so we gave it another year, and we thought springtime it would come back up. And this beautiful tree, this beautiful big tree that we just loved every year, now it was dead. We're like, what's going on? And a couple of friends of ours who knew what was going on, they said, hey, it's the ivy. You've let it grow out of control. Now, here in Chicagoland, we all love, ivy, and if you don't watch it, it like take over everything, right? And what we had allowed to do is we thought we were coming back enough, but the ivy kept on coming back stronger and more, and it was killing the roots of this Japanese tree. And we had someone actually come and check it out, and they said, if you rip out all the ivy surrounding this tree, next year the tree will come back to life because you've gotten rid of what's killing it. And I think that's what God wants to do in our lives, just like he wanted to do in the lives of Gideon and the lives of the people of Israel. He wants us to get rid of those things that are killing us in life. Those idols that we think are going to give us what we want in life, but they really are, in reality, they're killing us. And God says, you need to tear that down. If you really want to get up out of the wine press, tear down those idols. They're killing you. But as you're tearing those down, you need to build up something else. Maybe in your life, that's working on your love for people who are not like you, building up your prayer life, or forgiving others, or building up your willingness to sacrifice for others, or being compassionate, or maybe trust. Some of us in this room, we have some trust issues, and we need to build that back up. We need to build up the value of truth in our lives, or patience and kindness in our lives. You see, God's growth plan for your life and my life isn't that complicated. It's tearing down while we build up. That's how God grows our faith at our pace. Tearing down and building up. And that's what he's doing here with Gideon. In verse 27, it's working. Because Gideon obeys. Verse 27, so Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had commanded. He got up out of the winepress. He says, I'm ready to go. I'll do it. Bold move, by the way, tearing down all these idols. But he's not there yet. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord commanded, but he did it at night because he was still afraid of the other members of his father's household and the people of the town. You see, he had taken a big step of faith. He was slowly but surely becoming this legend that the people would talk about for thousands of years, but he wasn't there yet. It's a process. It's a process with Gideon. It's a process with you and with me. See, God has an end game. He's playing the long game with your life and my life. He's not concerned about what you do tomorrow as much as where you're heading. And he's got this big picture in mind. And the end game isn't Gideon defeating the Midianites. Not even close. God has a bigger end game than the people of those days could ever imagine. See, God's plan in that moment was to use the least of the least, a guy named Gideon, to rescue his people, his children, from the worst of the worst, the Midianites. But that wasn't his end game. The end game was seen about 1,000 years later when God revealed his ultimate plan through his son, Jesus Christ, a person who came to rescue his people again. And that includes you and me this time, anyone who would ever turn to him from the worst enemy ever, sin and death. More than 1,000 years after Gideon, God surprised his people again. With Gideon, God surprised his people that this guy named Gideon, who was sort of just this no-name person hiding out in the deep wine press, became a fierce warrior and with just a couple hundred men defeated an entire army. And once again, 1,000 years later, God surprised humanity again by this tiny little baby, born in a secluded place of a virgin mother in a barn to rescue his children again from not just the physical enemy of sin and death, but the spiritual enemy of Satan. And the way he did that is by picking up a cross and letting himself die on it. That's the end game with God, that he would rescue his children, his people, through his son, Jesus Christ. But what's even more interesting is, even before this happened, Jesus knew what was about to happen. And so before his death, and we're going to end with this, in John chapter 16, listen to these words that he speaks to those who would follow him. He says this, I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and many sorrows. Listen, Jesus says you will find yourself at times in the bottom of a wine press. There are going to be times in your life that life will be bigger than you. But Jesus says, take heart, because I have overcome the world. You see, it's when you and I are most overwhelmed that God chooses to reveal his overcoming power. And that overcoming power is revealed through his son, Jesus Christ. Will you pray with me? Father in heaven, we thank you for this story of Gideon. And even though it seems just so distant from our world today, God, we can relate. God, I know that there are some of us here that we feel like we're at the bottom of a wine press. We are so overwhelmed. God, I pray that this story of Gideon would be a source of encouragement for us and a source of hope. It's when we are most overwhelmed, when you are at your best. And you give us that overcoming power through your son, Jesus Christ. And that's why we're here. So God, I pray in these moments that you would continue to meet us right where we're at and speak to us. Allow your Spirit to speak to our souls, our hearts this morning. And it's in Jesus' name we pray this. Amen. So we want to give you some time to continue to reflect on this, and there's a couple ways to do it. One of our prayer team members is going to be against this wall, and if you just like to be prayed for something going on in your life, life is bigger than you, and you're overwhelmed right now, we want to come alongside you and pray for you. There's going to be 2 tables in the back, as always. One table is where you can pick up a communion packet. And we want to do this every week, celebrate what Jesus Christ did for us on the cross. And the cracker that represents the body that was broken and the blood that was shed. And because of that, we have hope. Because of that, we can overcome our overwhelming moments. There's also a table in the back by the sound booth that allows you to give of your offerings and tithes and to help expand God's kingdom through the local church of Journey. Maybe you just need to remain seated and think about those idols that you need to get rid of in your life and those things that you need to build up as God continues to grow your faith. So at this moment, as the Spirit of God leads you, feel free to do one of those things.